at the times of Hezekiah and exploring the consistency between archaeological finds and what the Bible actually says. Our hope being to strengthen our faith in the truth of God's word. Begin, if you will, by casting your minds back, if you can, to the times of the kingdom of Israel as a united nation. First established in the book of Exodus about 1600 BC, 3,500 years ago, when God said to the children of Israel, "Ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and holy nation." So the kingdom was born. When Israel entered into their own land after the time of Joshua and 450 years of judges, they sought a visible monarch to reign over them, like the nations around them. And then Saul was that first appointed king, and he began a very long line of kings before the eventual temporary overthrow of the kingdom because of wickedness. Now, Saul was succeeded by David, a man after God's own heart, and he gave way to Solomon, of whom we read, "His presence the kings of the earth sought to hear his wisdom that God had put in his heart." And Solomon's son was Rehoboam. He was the next king, and during his reign there was a revolt, and the kingdom, which were around 980 BC now, was divided into two, commonly referred to as the 10 tribes in the north and 2 tribes in the south. And the picture on the map hopefully just gives that summary of the divided kingdom. Now, the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, was overthrown because of wickedness, and this was brought about by the invasion of Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, during the reign of Hoshea, who was the last king of that northern kingdom of Israel. Now, Hezekiah, who we're dealing with this evening, lived at the same time as Hoshea. We're now about 720 BC, and he began to reign in Jerusalem at the age of 25, as we read in our introductory reading. And he was son of Ahaz, the previous king of Judah. And Ahaz, in the interest of himself, had made a deal with the mighty nation of Assyria. We just look on the map, we can see over to the right the empire of Assyria, and we can still see on the left-hand side there Samaria, the capital kingdom of the north, and Jerusalem, the capital kingdom of the south. Now, when Ahaz was king, Judah was threatened by an alliance between Syria and Israel. They joined forces together, and they were planning to overthrow Judah. And so by making a deal with Assyria, we find that the threat to Judah subsided. That record is in the scriptures, and it's quite detailed in the 2nd of Kings, chapters 15 and 16. We're essentially here dealing with international peace treaties and agreements between nations and understandings to bring about certain events. And here it was, of course, in the name of peace. Assyria came to help Judah, but from that moment on, the sovereignty of Judah was compromised, and they became, as it were, a tributary nation to Assyria, paying protection money each year. King Ahaz even went to visit the king of Assyria and brought back a copy of their altar that they used to worship their own gods. And he even defaced the temple furniture that Solomon had made, expressly according to God's pattern. He defiled it, and the true worship of God was almost totally extinguished, with all sorts of idolatry and false practices then being undertaken. And that was the reign of Ahaz, Hezekiah's father. Then in total contrast, when Hezekiah came to the throne, he was considered to be a good king in the eyes of God. And he attempts to reform Judah and re-establish true worship. And those efforts were met with prosperity because God looked down in favour upon that work. Now, there's principally 3 records of the life of Hezekiah in the Bible. There's one in the Kings, there's one in the Chronicles, which we were reading of a moment ago, and there's also one in the book of Isaiah, who was the prophet who lived at this time. And if we were to take all the 3 records of Hezekiah's life, we can establish quite clearly that unlike his father, Ahaz, he made a real effort to serve the God of Israel, the God of heaven and earth. And during the first month of his reign, he opened up the house of the Lord and brought in the priests and the Levites and re-established true worship. He repaired the temple, and Hezekiah sent invitations throughout Israel and Judah to come and keep the feast of Passover at Jerusalem. And many came, and we read these words: "For since the time of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, there was not the like." So it was an incredible moment with Hezekiah's reforms. And then the people went forth, destroying all the false images that they'd started to worship, and they abandoned the groves, and they broke them up into small pieces in favour of the true worship of the God of heaven and earth. And all this only took 7 months of Hezekiah's reign. It was a real transformation. The work of Hezekiah in the history of Judah was uniquely important. I'd like you to turn with me, if you will, to the 2nd of Kings and chapter 18, where we can see some of these things mentioned. The 2nd of Kings 18, reading at verse 1. "Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea," that's the last king of the northern kingdom, the son of Elah, king of Israel, "that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. 25 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that David his father did." Look with me at now verse 5. "He trusted in the Lord Yahweh, God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him." Verse 7. And the Lord Yahweh was with him, and he prospered whithersoever he went forth, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria, and served him not." Now that's a key moment, because whilst Hezekiah prospered in his work, it was in the 4th year of his reign that Shalmaneser came up against Samaria and took the northern kingdom into captivity, having besieged it. And it took 3 years for that siege to finally work, and the city fell, and Israel were carried away into captivity. The key then is that Hezekiah broke all his alliances with Assyria and rebelled against him, and refused to pay the money that was due. And so the activity of invading the northern kingdom and taking it away captive left Judah very isolated in this region of the world. Bear in mind, Assyria's empire was massive in its expanse, and just in the middle was this little pocket of the kingdom of Judah. Hezekiah still refused to pay the tribute money and placed his trust in the God of Israel, so that there after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah. Now then, verse 13 tells of the invasion of Judah by Sennacherib. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. So we have this encircling of Jerusalem as Sennacherib, the son of Shalmaneser, comes up against Judah, threatening to invade. He was the grandson of Shalmaneser. Now, if we look at the annals of Assyrian history, they lead us to believe that his reign began in about 705 BC. So we're dealing with events a long time ago. And immediately Sennacherib came to the throne. He was at war with his near neighbour Babylon, who we can see just on the right-hand side of the screen. And after he settled the affairs of Babylon, certainly for the time being, his attention turns towards securing the southern and eastern borders of his empire. And he then moved towards Palestine to deal with the rebellion of Hezekiah, Tyre and Sidon, and other small sovereigns who dared to question the might of his great power. And in the process of this offensive, verse 13, we just read, records the outlying cities that were taken as Sennacherib sweeps in like a river flooding into the land. And many of the population then were taken into captivity. These are important principles to remember when we look at the record of archaeology. So all the outlying cities were taken and lots of people went into captivity. So as the Assyrian army advanced, Hezekiah was very sensible in his preparations and plans for war and anticipated the possibility of a lengthy siege, especially so having witnessed the 3 years in which Assyria had besieged Samaria. And so certain preparations were made. Let's go back to the chapter we had read earlier, the 2nd of Chronicles and chapter 32. And we're going to just have a look again at the first few verses of chapter 32. So after these things and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered into Judah and encamped against the fenced cities and thought to win them for himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come and that he was purposed to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his princes and his mighty men to stop the waters of the fountains that were without the city, and they did help him. So there was gathered much people together, who stopped all the fountains and the brook that ran through the midst of the land, saying, Why should the king of Assyria come and find much water? And he went through other sensible preparations for warfare, building up the defences of the city. All of this was very logical and very sensible as he prepared for invasion. So why should the enemy come and besiege us and find a water supply just outside the city? And they determined to move that water supply out of sight in order to preserve it for the city and not have it there for the strengthening and sustenance of an invading army. Okay, so for a few moments we're going to examine exactly what Hezekiah did here, because just hidden behind those few verses we find one of the greatest engineering feats of ancient time. So what exactly did he do? In verse 30 of this chapter, we have it summarised. Verse 30. This same Hezekiah stopped the upper watercourse of Gihon and brought it straight down to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all his works. So here we have the city of Jerusalem pictured on the map. And the Gihon spring, which was mentioned in verse 30, we just read of, is just where that big black arrow is on the west side of the city. If we were to just enlarge that, you can just about see it on the map, I think, the Gihon spring. And it bubbled up outside of the city walls. So it was a perfect place for the encampment of an invading army to provide them with sustenance and supply. So very, very sensible to think, well, we're going to move that out of its place. So that spring then was in the valley of Kidron, outside the city walls. And by building an underground passage known as the conduit, the outward appearance of the spring disappeared from view, and the water flowed through underground into the city through a tunnel that was 1,800 feet long to bring the water into the city. So here you can see on the map exactly the route from the Gihon spring right the way into the lower part of the city so the water could flow. Using simple tools, many workers hewed their way through 1/3 of a mile of limestone rock. 2 teams hewed to half the time. They started at each end and they met in the middle. And the tunnel's about 6 foot high and very evenly cut throughout its length. In view of the height of the city, the tunnel had to stretch for quite a way to reach a point low enough for it to flow into the city, emerging at a point known as the Pool of Siloam. Now, the spring at its source was called Gihon, which means gushing fountain, typical of the rushing water that was seen at that end. And there was a long shaft not far from the Gihon within the city walls from where the water was once drawn up into the city. Now, this underground conduit was discovered in 1838 by Edward Robinson, a Bible archaeologist, And it's still there today. And I understand you can walk through it from one end to the other when the water level is low enough. And there's a photograph from inside the tunnel. Now, the Pool of Siloam inside the city is apparently not as big as it used to be, but nonetheless, it's all still there. And this is the place where Jesus sent the blind man to wash and receive his sight. I mean, what great vision Hezekiah had in the first place to construct the tunnel. Now, it wasn't until 1880, so that's about 50 years after the tunnel had been discovered. This is during an expedition by a German architect called Dr. Schick. And allegedly, a young boy fell into the pool, and the Pool of Siloam, and accidentally discovered an inscription in the wall of the tunnel just above the waterline and partly obscured by lime deposits. And this inscription turned out to be 6 lines of Hebrew recording the story of the excavation of the tunnel. That's the entrance to the tunnel at the Pool of Siloam end in the city of Jerusalem. Now, the inscription was removed from the wall, and the original is now in a museum in Istanbul, in Turkey. But before it was removed, an impression was taken, and a replica is in the British Museum. Now, if we were to read the inscription, that's the replica that's in the museum. What does it say? It says, "This is the narrative of the tunnelling. While the stonecutters were wielding the picks, each toward his co-worker, the picks each toward his co-worker, and while there were still 3 cubits to tunnel through, the voice of a man was heard calling out to his co-worker, because there was a fissure in the rock running from south to north. And on the final day of tunnelling, each of the stonecutters was striking the stone forcefully so as to meet his co-worker pick after pick. And then the water began to flow from the source of the pool, a distance of 1,200 cubits, and 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the stone cutters." Now, Professor Rendell Short of the University of Bristol wrote in 1942 that there is no reasonable doubt that this is the work of Hezekiah's royal engineers. As part of the defences for the city, Hezekiah tried to build the morale of his people. And not only did he build up the walls, build up the strength of the city, he then tried to build up his people and encourage them to trust in God. Although this must have been difficult in his day, seeing the rest of Judah, the outlying cities, all swallowed up by an invading force, having seen the northern kingdom of Israel swept away by the Assyrians, and building up the strength of your people in a tiny city in comparison was a very difficult task. The prophet Isaiah foretold of these events when he describes the king of Assyria like an overflowing river. He shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks, and he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. So a very vivid prophetic picture of the Assyrians flooding into the land right up to the neck. And of course the head was Jerusalem, which was not invaded. Now, Judah in the past had put their trust in Egypt for deliverance, and there were those in Judah still prepared to call upon the might of iron chariots and trust in their own strength. But Hezekiah's trust was in God, and he said, "With us is Yahweh, our God, to help us and to fight our battle." So strengthening the resolve and the morale and the faith of his people. So Sennacherib came with an almighty army and swept through the cities of Judah. He sent messengers to Hezekiah and took his army down to Lachish, southwest of Jerusalem. And this was part of a wider strategy to cut off any assistance that Judah might seek from Egypt, which had been their want in the past. Now, even though Hezekiah tried to negotiate peace, if we were to look in 2 Kings 18 verse 14, he offered the money that was due to Sennacherib to try and negotiate peace. But Sennacherib was dishonourable because he took the money and still continued his invasion with an overthrowing intent towards Jerusalem. Sennacherib then came with a great host to a place near the city walls called the conduit of the upper pool, a surface canal made in the time of David or Solomon. So a great exchange took place between the Israelites or those of Judah that were in Jerusalem and the invading army across the city walls as the inhabitants of Jerusalem were locked and penned inside the city, surrounded by the Assyrians. The Assyrians blasphemed the God of Israel and suggested that because no gods of any of the other nations had been able to save them, so Jerusalem would be the same. Hezekiah was quick to point out that as the nations around them trusted in wood and stone as their gods, of course their gods couldn't deliver them from the might of the Assyrian, as they weren't the true and living God that he was trusting in. So Hezekiah sends messengers to the prophet Isaiah, and the prophet sends a message back. Come back with me to the 2nd of Kings in chapter 19, and where we have the record of the message coming back from Isaiah the prophet, of whom it was common for the kings to refer to in their day. 2nd of Kings 19 and verse 6. And Isaiah said unto them, Thus shall ye say to your master, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Be not afraid of the words which thou hast heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumour, and shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. So, Rabshakeh returned to Sennacherib and communicated Hezekiah's defiance. And as a result, the mighty Assyrian host came and laid siege to Jerusalem as they defied Hezekiah. This time Hezekiah had the same threat, but he received it by a letter, which he took and laid it upon in the house of Yahweh and prayed and received a response. In verse 32 of this chapter, Therefore, thus saith Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, He shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith Yahweh, for I will defend this city, to save it for mine own sake, and for my servant David's sake. So deliverance and protection were given by Yahweh, and Jerusalem on this occasion was not overthrown. And Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem were saved from the hand of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. So that sort of completes the historical dialogue and the narrative around these events, which are reasonably clear for us to understand. And we certainly have some archaeological evidence to show that tunnel was built. Now, it was the custom of the kings of Assyria to record their campaigns and set in stone their achievements, although, as you would expect, they were always less colourful about their failures. The monuments they produced were buried by tradition in the corners of rooms, in houses, in tombs, and they were there for posterity and for the pleasure of the idols that they worshipped. Now, Sennacherib was no exception. He carefully recorded his military achievements. And one such record is in the form of a clay prism that was discovered in 1880 by Colonel R. Taylor whilst excavating in Nineveh, the former capital of Assyria. And this is a picture of the clay prism. The original 6-sided prism photographed in this picture is on display in the British Museum, and a complete transcript has kindly been supplied by the Department of Assyrian Antiquities. Now, the prism itself records 8 campaigns of Sennacherib, one of which happens to be his assault on Jerusalem, which is very interesting when we compare it with the record that we've been reading in the Bible. 8 records of campaigns. 7 of them have very graphic language depicting overwhelming victory and language is used of things like not one escaped. Their corpses I hung on stakes. I set them on fire. I besieged. I captured. I destroyed. I devastated. I burned with fire. I shattered his host. I conquered. I decimated the enemy host. I cut their throats. Merciless, vicious, aggressive, ruthless was the king of Assyria. Only a man full of his own importance would record such terrible boasting. It wasn't customary for the kings to record their defeats. It's therefore not surprising to see no defeat of his forces detailed in the 8th account of the assault on Jerusalem. But neither is there any great victory recorded either. It's quite remarkable to see details of the exchange with Hezekiah and the overthrow of the fenced cities of Judah, in line, perfectly in line with the Bible record. No claims to have overthrown Jerusalem itself, which again is consistent with the Bible record. Now, if we were to have a look at what the Prism actually says, this is the record concerning Hezekiah. It's only an extract. As for Hezekiah, the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small cities in their neighbourhoods, and by bringing up siege engines, by attacking and storming on foot, by mines, tunnels and breaches, I besieged and took those cities. 200,000 people, great and small, male and female, horses, mules, asses, camels, cattle and sheep, without number, I brought away from them and counted as spoil. And so the attack on the cities of Judah, which we read of in the record of the Kings, is recorded there in the Bible. And we've already seen it in 2 Kings 18, verse 13. In the 14th year of Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. We're even told in Isaiah chapter 10 the route the invading forces took. Whilst the overthrow of Lachish is not recorded on the Prism, or not in this particular Prism, there are other stone relief sculptures at the British Museum which depict Sennacherib carried in his sedan chair receiving the spoils of Lachish. The Prism continues with details of the siege of Jerusalem. I shut up Jerusalem, his royal city. Earthworks I threw up against him. The one coming out of the city gate I turned back to his misery. And so whilst Sennacherib himself was still engaged at Lachish, he sent his host to Jerusalem. He annexed all the land around about Jerusalem. The cities of his which I had despoiled, I cut off from his land, and to Mitinti, king of Ashdod, Padai, king of Ekron, and Silibel, king of Gaza, I gave, and I diminished his land. I added to the former tribute, and laid upon him the giving of their land, imposts, gifts for my majesty. Now, those cities mentioned here, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, were all originally taken by Hezekiah from the Philistines, recorded in the 2nd of Kings 18 and verse 18, where it says, he smote the Philistines, even unto Gaza, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. So these are the outlying cities that were in the domain of the king of Judah, Hezekiah, and Sennacherib had swept through and taken them all. Everything we've read so far is consistent with the Bible record. As for Hezekiah, the terrifying splendour of my majesty overcame him, and the Arabs and his mercenary troops, which he had brought in to strengthen Jerusalem, his royal city, deserted him. In addition to the 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, there were gems and jewels and couches of ivory, house chairs of ivory, elephant hide, ivory, ebony, boxwood, all kinds of valuable treasures, as well as his daughters, his harem, his male and female musicians he had bring after me to Nineveh, my royal city, to pay tribute, and to accept servitude he dispatched his messengers. Now, is this the tribute that Hezekiah offered to Sennacherib to try and negotiate peace? which was a common practice in those days, and that's recorded in the 2nd of Kings 18, verses 14 to 16. As it happened, even the offer of tribute, it appears that Sennacherib took that, but still continued his invasion in a very dishonourable fashion. But on this prism, there is no mention made of Hezekiah's defiance. No mention is made of the disaster that overcame the Assyrians when 185,000 lives were lost in the siege of Jerusalem without so much as an arrow being fired. Clearly, such comments would undermine the record of Sennacherib's achievement and tarnish his image that he wanted to preserve for the reader. And so, in truth, Jerusalem was delivered by the hand of Yahweh, and Sennacherib then, after the huge defeat of his army, returned to Nineveh. In 2 Kings 19 and verse 36, so Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer his sons smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. So for all that we've read and understood of this campaign against Hezekiah and the defences that he prepared and the encouragement of his people, the records found in these Assyrian archaeological finds are all in harmony with the Bible account of this part of Hezekiah's life and provides us with some reasonable external evidence of the accuracy of the scriptures. Nothing that we've read recorded on that prism contradicts what we've read in the scriptures. Some of the moments of defeat are missing, which is understandable because that's how the kings of that day recorded their adventures. So chapter 20 of the 2nd of Kings goes on to record that during the time of the siege, Hezekiah was a sick man. So ill, he was near to death. And he prayed to God for mercy and called upon God to remember his faithfulness. And as a result, 15 years were added to his life. Now, the entire record of the life of Hezekiah can teach us all a powerful lesson. And this is the important takeaway for all of us as we consider these very interesting pieces of history and the archaeological evidence that supports them. What's here for us to take away from this time together? Well, the record of Hezekiah's life is a lesson for us in itself. Hezekiah was under siege to an enemy. We are under siege to sin every day. The threat of our minds being overthrown is there all the time. Our conscience and moral integrity are targets for constant attack. We're people of flesh and blood, and our sin-ridden nature is such that we are sick unto death. It is a certainty that our life is limited. As Hezekiah put his trust in Yahweh and harnessed the Gihon spring to provide sustenance for his people, life-giving water in a time of siege, so we must place our trust in God, and we can harness the water of the word of life by reading it to sustain us in this life, giving us hope of life to come. We read in the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 55, "How every one that thirsteth, come ye to the waters, incline your ear and come unto me, hear and your soul shall live." We have no tangible alternative in a world that is falling apart with economic, with political and social unrest everywhere we turn. We have no alternative but to put our trust in God, put our minds to obeying his commandments and being baptized into the saving name of Jesus Christ. And then by God's grace, our lives will be extended, not by 15 years, but by the gift of everlasting life in God's future kingdom that will be established at the return of Jesus Christ. So by confirming the truth and accuracy of the Bible record, we can increase our confidence and our faith in the promises made to the fathers, the promise of the kingdom of Israel restored. By God's grace, his undeserved favour toward us the offer of a place in that kingdom is extended if we respond now.